Our next speaker will share some information with you about one of the ballot measures this fall in North Dakota. Geoff Simon is Executive Director of the Western Dakota Energy Association, which represents cities, counties, and school districts in the oil, gas, and coal producing counties. Geoff is chairman of a coalition called North Dakotans for Sound Government, a group of business and energy companies, including the Lignite Energy Council, that is urging citizens to vote no on Measure 1. Please welcome Geoff Simon.
Thanks for that introduction, Kevin. We had a chance to chat a little briefly beforehand. You know, Kevin and I are both big global warming fans, so we had a chance to catch up a little bit on some of the latest that's going around. You know, I tend to be a little bit of a joker sometimes, but this is a very serious issue I want to talk to you about today. You know, this Measure 1 has been billed as an anti-corruption measure, and for a time, you know, the standard school of thought was this is a slam dunk, it's going to pass easily, until the Greater North Dakota Chamber held its policy summit in the middle of August. And one of the reasons I think you should probably vote no on this is the fact that the Greater North Dakota Chamber had a hard time finding someone actually willing to speak against an anti-corruption measure. This thing is fraught with all sorts of problems, and I'm going to go through them with you, but I mean the fact that it would tend to stifle free speech, that's the real concern about this measure. As I said, there's probably about a dozen good reasons to vote no on this. I'm going to go through a few of them. First thing off, this is a constitutional measure, and enactments like this really don't belong in the state constitution. This measure contains about 1,400 words. The purpose of the Constitution, the way I think about it, is to establish, you know, some basic principles, not overly prescriptive kinds of things. This is more like legislation. And the problem with it is because it's a constitutional measure, if it should pass, the legislature has no power to fix all these problems that are within it. So I'm going to start going through those with you. First up, you know, I said it's billed as an anti-corruption measure, which, you know, sort of kind of sucks you in. Nobody's in favor of corruption, right? But here's the thing. Most of the money behind this measure came from out-of-state money. I mean, it's out-of-state special interest groups that put all the money into this. Only $4,250 has come from North Dakota citizens in this. They've gotten over $500,000 in out-of-state special interest money, much of it from Represent Us, which is an organization that generally promotes measures that regulate political speech. And the fact of the matter is, when you try to regulate speech, you tend to discourage that speech. So what's the problem here? The proponents of this measure claim that they have a right to know who's spending money to influence our elections. Well, we already require political candidates to file campaign finance disclosure. Any amounts over $200, they're reported. So, you know, we kind of tend to know who's influencing that election. Ballot measures, we have a right to know who's spending money there. Well, yeah, we have a law on the books already. Any contributions over $100 to ballot measure committees have to be reported to the Secretary of State's office, and it's disclosable, it's available online. The ironic thing about this measure, because it would actually raise that limit to $200. And, you know, we wouldn't know, like, for example, when we relax those reporting requirements, right now, any out-of-state contributions from organizations like Represent Us have to be disclosed as well, the individual contributors. So these are some of the individual contributors who helped get this on the ballot. Now, you got to ask yourself, what does Tyler Perry care about policy making in North Dakota? But you just need to know that a lot of the money that got this measure on the ballot came from these out-of-state groups. So the First Amendment thing I mentioned, I call it an attack on the First Amendment. Actually, I called it a solution in search of a problem as well. This is kind of paraphrased. It's a big long sentence in section 1.2 of the measure that describes who has to disclose their contributions. So if you look at the plain language of that, it would require public disclosure of the ultimate and true source of funds spent in any amount greater than $200 in any medium to lobby or otherwise influence government action. So that means anybody who engages in public policy has to report that. So, but the problem with that is, if you look at the language of the measure here, whoops, went back one too far. There are no exceptions. Right now, lobbyists have to file expense reports. So we know lobbyists have to disclose anything that's valued at more than $60 that's given to a public official. But this would pull in all kinds of people, private citizens. If you live out of town, you drive to Bismarck to testify on a bill or to appear at a PSC hearing or any board or state commission, or even if you're involved in some type of public-private partnership, if you have a state contract for something like that, you're in the process of influencing public policy. The language is so broad that it would encompass all sorts of people. For example, all the trade unions, any member of a union, the unions employ lobbyists, the unions would have to disclose the names of their contributors, the names of their members, and the amount that they've contributed. Charitable organizations would have to report their donors. This is so extremely broad that it would even include churches. Churches do a lot of social service work in partnership with state government, so they're attempting to influence state government action as well. So can you imagine churches would be required to disclose the names and addresses of their parishioners and how much they put in the collection plate? That's just how extreme this measure actually is. It's so bad, you probably heard this last week, the American Civil Liberties Union, which is generally viewed as a left-leaning organization, has come out on record in opposition to this measure as well, because the ACLU believes this is an affront to freedom of speech. The thing of it is, when you're forced to disclose those sorts of things, it tends to discourage your participation. You're a little bit afraid about maybe having your name disclosed and maybe being subject to harassment. There's an example of that in our history. If you look at the NAACP ruling of 1958, we lost the slide. Anyway, the NAACP in 1958 had a case with the state of Alabama. The state of Alabama actually demanded that the NAACP disclose its member lists. So can you imagine 1958, the civil rights movement is happening out there, and all of a sudden the NAACP is being asked to disclose its members, and what would they be subjected to? Harassment, intimidation, or even worse? The Supreme Court took a look at that case, and it ruled unanimously that the government could not force groups to disclose their lists. And on that basis, I think Section 1.2 of Measure 1 would ultimately be found unconstitutional if it were challenged, and I suspect if this measure somehow passes that it would be found unconstitutional and that action or that litigation would happen. Here's the other thing. It sets up basically a new branch of government. It creates an ethics commission, basically a new unaccountable bureaucracy. It's a 5-member commission, and it would apply to people at all levels of state government, boards, commissions. Some of those are volunteer boards and commissions, but it would affect all those public officials. The problem with that, again, there's really no direction provided. The measure provides no limits to its authority. The commission could even write its own rules, which, as you know, administrative rules have the same effect as law. And, the thing that really bothers me about this, we talk about corruption, and we've asked the proponents of this measure, the people who put it on the ballot, what are you trying to fix? Where is the problem? Where is the corruption? And generally speaking, we just kind of get blank stares. They really haven't specifically identified it. They just say it's kind of, it's out there. And, it suggests to me that this is just more or less a feel-good measure. They put it on the ballot to do something, but it could create total havoc on our system. And I'll tell you why. So the Ethics Commission includes a provision for an anonymous hotline. So you can call in or write an anonymous letter, submit a tip about some type of unethical behavior. Well, sometimes you don't want to necessarily have your name published, but the problem with this measure here is our state constitution isn't going to allow the allegations that are submitted to the commission to remain confidential. The person might remain confidential, But because we have open meeting and open records laws, those allegations are going to be made public. Now, can you imagine what happens if, I mean, you've seen the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. These allegations may be true, may not be true. But imagine if a candidate, a week or two out from an election, suddenly is accused of, oh, I don't know, associating with a drug dealer. Then that's the accusation that falls in front of the commission. Well, now they have the power to investigate that, but also the media has an opportunity to demand disclosure of that. Well, you know, we don't want politicians hanging out with drug dealers, and it could, you know, ultimately influence the outcome of that election. And then later on, it turns out, oh, that candidate was actually just meeting with a pharmacist. You know, I mean, that's maybe a kind of a silly example, but those are the kinds of gamesmanship, you know, people could use this for partisan advantage. It, you know, you could throw all kinds of crazy allegations in front of this ethics commission. I mentioned at the outset this is a constitutional measure. The proponents claim, you know, it's not their intent that some of these ill consequences happen, but the fact of the matter is the legislature can't fix this. I mean, the language is what it is. The words are what they are. And because it also provides for the opportunity for a citizen lawsuit, you can almost guarantee that some of these things are going to happen, because if they don't, you know, the legislature will be compelled to by a citizen lawsuit. The language of the measure, as you can see there, the underlined language says that the legislature may not hamper, restrict, or in any way impair implementation of this article. It could broaden it potentially, but it cannot in any way contain it or restrict it in any way. Here's another thing about this measure that really kind of bothers me. It sort of, I guess I'd say, attempts to suck in the voters by putting in there all sorts of good ideas that are already in the law. You know, banning candidates from using campaign contributions for personal benefit, banning foreign contributions. You know, if you look already, here we go. I mean, personal use of campaign contributions, it's prohibited. Here's the statute, Chapter 16. That's already in law. Candidates can't use their contributions for personal gain. Foreign contributions banned from elections? Yeah, that's already in state law too. So why do we need to put it in a constitutional measure on the ballot? We've already got it. Again, fixing something that isn't broken. These are good ideas. And voters who read this, I mean, I've had people say, well, I've read through that. I don't see any problem with this. Well, I don't see any problem with that either. You know, we shouldn't have foreign contributions. They say we need a new, you know, conflict of interest standards for state government employees. We've got a definition of conflict of interest now. If there's any way in making a decision, a state employee can somehow stand to benefit from a decision, they're obligated to recuse themselves or, you know, step aside and not participate in that decision-making process. It's already in the law. It also has these other provisions that ban lobbyist gifts, prohibit lobbyists from delivering campaign contributions. Bundling is the practice that we've called it, and prohibits public officials from lobbying for at least 2 years after they've left public office. You know, what I find bad about this is, you know, it sort of kind of attempts to taint lobbying as something that, you know, shouldn't happen. Lobbyists are educators. I mean, we generally will explain to legislators both sides of an issue. We're not just all that one-sided about it. I don't think the legislative process would function without lobbyists. We're essential to the process. How else would they get information if you didn't have lobbyists there? And it's an open and honest and transparent process now. As I said, lobbyists are compelled to file disclosure reports. Their expenditure reports have to be filed annually. So if this was on the books, how would that change it? What would improve it? I mean, we've got a good process now. I don't think we need to mess around with it. And you know, here's the other concern. This is the very last sentence of the measure. It would override any other provisions in the Constitution with which it might conflict. So there are other protections provided in the state constitution. Your guaranteed rights, Article 1, the Declaration of Citizen Rights. Government is basically there for the protection and security of its citizens. So people own the government, but it could potentially override that. Everybody is entitled to write and speak as they please. This potentially overrides that because it would discourage your participation in the public policy process. You'd suddenly have to write down how much you're spending and where your income comes from, and then send that to the government, and then it's in a disclosable database. Anybody could look it up. They're going to have your address, and they can come and, you know, protest at your house or egg your house or whatever. It's just really a terribly bad idea. People have the right to assemble peaceably to address their grievances. These are the kinds of protections that could be overridden by this measure. I think it's a big concern. So with that, I think I'm going to try to get us back on schedule, and I would urge you to vote no on Measure 1. I'd also point out real quickly, you can find a website. It's called ND Measure 1, the number 1. ndmeasure1.com is the website for North Dakotans for Sound Government, and you can also find us on Facebook now.